I would have saved that till the end, because you said exciting and entertaining. And, last week I had a kids' book out aimed at 9 to 15-year-olds, and that is genuinely good fun. This isn't. This is not the exciting entertainment version. You've chosen to come to an hour's lecture, 75 slides, which are mostly about genocide. So hope you enjoy. Thank you very much for this honor. It is a great honor and a privilege to receive this award. And I particularly want to thank Professor Aoife McLeisert from Trinity College Dublin, who nominated me for this award, but she's not here because she's got COVID. So I think she might be watching. Hi, Aoife, thanks. Now, I don't have a great track record in receiving such honors. And by that, I mean, I have a sort of very childish schoolboy rebellion streak in me, which I have not managed to shake at the age of 48. And how this manifests is a slight, perhaps gracelessness in being invited to give prestigious lectures, which happens relatively often for me. So, for example, last year I was asked to talk about eugenics at the Crick Institute, the astonishing research institute named after the great Francis Crick. And it was to be about eugenics. But I felt compelled to point out that Francis Crick, well into the 70s, was quite keen on eugenics. And in this private letter, the quote is, eugenics gave the Nazis a bit of a bad name, and I think we should try and make it respectable again. Not ideal. Incidentally, the recipient of the Haldane Award last year, Matthew Cobb, is writing the definitive biography of Francis Crick, and I've read parts of it, and it is really juicy. This is just the thin end of the wedge. Another example is that in 2016, I was asked to give the Voltaire lecture for the humanists, British humanists, Humanist UK, Voltaire being one of the great voices of the Enlightenment. And I felt compelled to point out that Voltaire was an astonishing racist, a polygynist who believed that sub-Saharan African people were a different species to white people. They still gave me the award at the end of it. And in fact, 2 years later, they chose me as the president of Humanist UK. At which point, I was invited to give a speech in my inaugural presidential introduction to the humanists, and I felt compelled to point out that previous humanist presidents were also astonishing racists and eugenicists. No. So that joke only works if Alice is in the room, but unfortunately, she also is not very well. But I do have to check with her that she isn't a eugenicist. No, in fact, I'm referring to Julian Huxley, a great figurehead in science and evolutionary biology, a scientist initially who then became a science communicator, a writer alongside H.G. Wells, produced some astonishing work in the 1920s and 30s, and then became a TV presenter, presenting the first TV programs on the BBC about genetics, about evolution, and was directed by a young David Attenborough. Now, again, what an astonishing life, an astonishing figurehead, and once the president of Humanist UK, or became Humanist UK. And so there are some similarities between him and me, apart from the fact that he remained a great eugenicist throughout his life, driven by his left-wing politics. And you can see from this quote that he makes the classic error of eugenicists, which is to compare humans to livestock, and then goes on to suggest that we should halt the inevitable decline of us by using eugenics. Now, over the course of this talk, I'm going to be quite rude about a lot of our intellectual forebears. And I know that some of you will be thinking one or all of the following sentiments which crop up when we talk about the ideas of our intellectual forebears. We are in an era where we are assessing our intellectual ancestors. And I think this is really important, not just because it's interesting and not just because it's the history of our field, and I've become a sort of de facto historian of evolutionary genetics, but because it really forms the way we practice science today and how the structural biases in society percolate into science and into our practices and how history has served them up to us. But most important, and something I'll touch on later, is how these legacies by these great men of science persist in how we teach genetics today. Now, some of the canards, some of the caveats that come with this sort of discussion go like this. Angry men on the internet shouting at me, "You are rewriting history." I'm going to go through each one of these and break them down. I'll do it quite quickly. "You are rewriting history" is possibly the most fatuous thing you can say to a historian. History is rewriting the past. It is literally the definition of history is to rewrite what has already happened. You can't change the past, but we continually reassess with new evidence and contemporary values what has already happened. Rewriting history is what historians do. The second one, you are erasing history. Well, no, we're creating history. History is the analysis of the past, and by doing that analysis, we are actually documenting history. So again, we're not erasing it, we're exposing it. Of course, you can't judge people by today's standards. Now, this is a sort of central tenet of history, and it is true, but it is used almost exclusively to shut down conversations about our historical forebears, our intellectual ancestors. You can assess the opinions and the actions of people from the past by contextualizing them to their contemporaries. And that aligns with the often shouted, well, they were men of their time, which I think is an equally fatuous thing to say, because it's quite impossible not to be a man of your time. But again, it is designed and expressed in order to shut down conversations analyzing our ancestors. And not just that, but it also is, what was I going to say? I had a really important point here, and it's completely gone. Do you want the money back? Here, take it back. It was about being a man of your time, and I should make better notes for this. It was an important point. And it was, I'll come back to it. It'll come back to me in 2 slides' time, and I'll interrupt myself about this. But what is really important is that we should be interested in the scholarship of our fields, not just because it's interesting, as I say, but because the history of genetics influences how we have conversations about genetics, about evolution, and how we teach it today. And that is the most important thing. And then there's one more, which is that the personal views of individuals are irrelevant to their scientific practices. And that is one that I'm going to be tackling in some detail over the next hour or so. And also bear in mind that, we stand on these privileged positions, and it's all very well me standing here 100 years afterwards and saying that these men had terrible opinions and they were values of their time. And in 100 years' time, people will be standing on this same stage and doing the same for us. And that's fine, and that's how history should be. Have a think about the things that we will be cancelled for. The obvious ones are our action on climate change, our eating meat, which I continue to do, but there are loads of other things that we will think in 50 or 100 years' time. God, can you believe that we used to do that? Now, one of the things and why I think this is important to have this discussion now is that the field of biology as a broad discipline, but more specifically evolutionary biology and ultimately genetics, was founded not in parallel with political ideologies, but in service of them. So Jonathan mentioned up front that I've written a lot about the history and the invention of scientific racism, which occurs in the 17th or 18th centuries. And this is a statement and a sentence that I've said often over the last few years since I wrote a book called How to Argue with a Racist. And what I find is that if you say this to historians, they nod in agreement. And if you say it to geneticists, they go, really? Is that right? But it is absolutely true that the invention of race occurred at a time when European expansion and colonialism was the political ideology of the West, and that the classification system that was designed by Carl Linnaeus, when it was applied to humans, was specifically not simply to introduce classification and taxonomy to humans, but to introduce hierarchical classification to humans. And so in his 10th edition of Systemae Naturae, the book in which he attempts to describe all living things, animals, vegetables, but also minerals, that didn't really catch on, using the binomial Latin taxonomic system that we continue to use to this day, genus and species. In the 10th edition, he introduced Homo sapiens, and with that, introduced 4 subcategories. We might have called them subspecies later, although I think most evolutionary biologists reject that subcategorization today. But he introduced 4 subcategories for humans, and they are these: Homo sapiens americanus, Asiaticus, and Africanus. And the first phenotype used to classify them is a physical trait. It is skin pigmentation. And the second is hair color and texture. So there you have 2 physical characteristics used to taxonomize humans. And I won't read them out. You can read them for yourselves. But I've only included 3 there, and you can see that what follows from the physical characteristics of skin color and pigment and hair color and texture is unequivocal value judgments which are racist in any age. And of course, the 4th one was Homo sapiens europaeus, who are white-skinned with blue eyes, are gentle, acute, inventive, and governed by laws. Now, every attempt to classify humans from this point onwards until the 20th century was hierarchical. It wasn't simply classification or taxonomic, it was hierarchical, and there isn't a single example of this taxonomy which doesn't put white Western Europeans at the top of that tree. Now, we now know, and this is a good and celebratory trajectory for genetics, we now know that genetics is the field, the only field, which has dismantled this. But the intellectual legacy of this in our culture is that these are still broadly the terms and the classifications that we use for the socially constructed taxonomy that we continue to use today. It was characterized and defined by Linnaeus in the 18th century, and its legacy persists in our behaviors today. And I always like to add, in the 11th edition, he added a 5th category, Homo sapiens monstroso, which included feral children, alpine dwarfs, wolf children, and what he described as mono-orchid Hottentots, which, do I need to explain what that means? Right. Okay. Well, the Hottentots is an old-fashioned, an archaic word for the people of the Khoikhoi or Khoisan tribes people from southern Africa now. That was what we used to call them in the 18th century. Why are orchids called orchids? What do they look like? And what do they look like? Testicles. So orchis is the Greek word for testicles, and the roots of an orchid look like testicles. So what is a mono-orchid Hottentot? Yeah, I mean, there is a reason for this, we think. One of our colleagues, Ruth Mace, has speculated on this, which is that in certain African tribes, identical twins are considered cursed. And at the time, in the 18th and 19th century, it was thought that identical twins were the progeny of sperm from one of each of a man's testicles. So single bald men, bald, not as in no hair. Mono-orchid men were. I did not plan this talk to go like this. Okay, so the foundations of biology are not as an academic field, but as a field in service of a political ideology of European expansionism. Race is invented to serve racism. Now, the main sort of central thesis of this branch of my work can be summed up in the next title slide, which is that scientists make bad historians. There's a lot of scientists in the room here, including my boss and my boss's boss, and most of my department. So I don't know how this is going to go down tomorrow. But this assertion, my opinion here, is based on 2 ideas. And the first is that scientists often think that history is easy and that the evidence of history is not taken as seriously as the evidence that we collect and analyze in our own data. And I think this is a failure of scientists to understand the discipline, the academic discipline of history, which is, let's face it, much, much older than the scientific disciplines. And we see it all the time. We see it in the way that we analyze the great men of our past that I will talk about today. And we see it in the fact that scientists can think that they can understand the history of a field by looking at the Wikipedia page or by reading a biography. And historians, real historians, look at scientists' analysis of their own history and find it risible. I know this through my own experience, and I have become a de facto historian, but it is hard because it is an academic discipline that I think most of us as scientists, I'm looking, all the UCL people are over here, so I keep looking over them. I'll talk to you people over here. We stopped doing academic history when we were 16 or 17. And it turns out there's loads of academic history and techniques and tools that need to be learned after that. But nevertheless, we get into situations where scientists talk about history and they mostly get it wrong, and I think mostly because they don't take the data and the evidence seriously. Here's a great example of that. James Watson, the co-discoverer of the double helix in 1953. Now, many of you will know of the work of James Watson. Many of you will also know that he's possibly best described as a troubled man. I think his racism and misogyny are not very well hidden, but I'm not here to discuss that. In his classic 1968 book, The Double Helix, his description, his personal description of the discovery of the double helix in 1953, the run-up to it and the aftermath, which is a fantastic book and well worth everyone in this room's time. It really is just such a great story. And that's what it is. It is a story. We now know that lots of it is fictional. And the analysis of it that is still ongoing. And another biography is being written of Watson today, in which the approach is taken by a science historian called Nathaniel Comfort. The approach taken is that this should be read and understood like a novel. We know, for example, that Francis Crick never went into the Eagle pub in Cambridge and declared that we have discovered the secret of life. We know that because James Watson told us that in 2018. He revealed that never had happened, and he made it up because it was a good line. Now, the biggest story that emerges from this, and the one that has become more politically charged than anything, is the way that he describes Rosalind Franklin. And the narrative that emerges from the book itself is that Watson is deeply misogynistic towards her and says frequently sexist, horrible things about her appearance. Now, he apologized for several of those in the second edition, but they remain in print and in the original text unchanged. But the repercussions of that is that there has been a massive backlash against the way he treats Rosalind Franklin in that book. And the problem with that is that it's equally fictitious. And so most of the narratives about what Rosalind Franklin actually did during the 1952 to into the 60s era are the stories we tell each other are equally wrong, and we continue to play into James Watson's narrative as a result of that. He spun a bunch of misogynistic lies in his book, and as a result, we responded with a bunch of equally inaccurate statements about what her role is. And again, Matthew Cobb is documenting this really accurately, and him and Nathaniel Comfort published a paper that was published in Nature earlier this year, which is a much better description of what actually happened and what Watson and Crick actually thought about Franklin. And the truth of the matter is that it makes her a more interesting character, it makes her a better scientist, it slightly exonerates Watson's misogyny, but only slightly. And so here we have a situation where, how many years have we gone from this? 50, 60 years after the events itself, we're still correcting the history of the story that we continue to tell ourselves about this momentous event in the history of science. And why? Because we haven't analyzed the data correctly, because we read this book, which should be understood as a novel, and we read it as fact. And so for the last 50 years, we've been telling ourselves a story in service only to one person, and that is James Watson's narrative. Scientists are bad at history. The second reason, I think, is that there has been a great reluctance amongst scientists to abandon the great man theory of history. So the great man theory of history is an idea that was formalized in the 1840s by a writer called Thomas Carlyle. And it was basically that the innate abilities and heroic acts and divine inspiration of individuals, always men, that is how history could be explained. Now, it's my contention that in science, we remain bewitched by this great man theory. In academic history, this is an idea that was largely abandoned 20, 30, maybe 40 years ago, because it doesn't explain history, and it doesn't explain history that happens to most people. But we still continue in our teachings of the history of science to draw straight lines from Aristotle all the way up to the Nobel Prizes. The Nobel Prizes, along with the Oscars, I think are the only prizes that are recognized globally by everyone. And I think they fundamentally miss... Are there any Nobel Prize winners in the audience? I don't care. I think they fundamentally misrepresent how science is done and continue to perpetuate myths about how science is done by reinforcing the notion of great man theory. And as for the Oscars, well, you know, Citizen Kane was beaten by How Green Is My Valley, so that's rubbish, isn't it? Now, when it comes to science and the history of science and the field that I have some expertise in, the great man theory is first really focused upon and identified by Francis Galton. And I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about Francis Galton. He actually pays my salary as well, so I'm slightly grateful for that. But I think it's quite funny that I spend most of my life being rude about him. Anyway, so Francis Galton's first work before he got into eugenics was a travel book. He went around the world after his father had died, and he traveled mostly around Africa and into the Middle East, and came back even more racist than he was when he left. But his second book and his first sort of wander into what became eugenics came in 1869, and it's a book called Hereditary Genius, in which he set out to prove, which no one had done before, but he set out to prove using statistics and new statistical techniques that he himself had invented, that the great men of history were great because it ran in their families they didn't have the word genetic, but in a biological way. And he set out to prove, he was singularly uninterested in women, so it is only men in this book. Women, according to Galton at this time, are simply vesicles in which to incubate great men. So he talks about the judges of England, statesmen at the time of George III, the premiers, meaning the prime ministers during the last 100 years, but also commanders, men of literature, men of science, painters, poets, and musicians. And then because these are all intellectual pursuits, he has a short chapter on the classes of oarsmen and wrestlers. And with this, he demonstrates using statistical techniques that there are a consistent proportion of men in societies will be great across basically a standard deviation, a bell curve of abilities. And these great men represent the two standard deviations above the average. And at the far end, the other end of the scale, you have the same proportion of people who are undesirable. They have qualities which are undesirable for the British stock. And this was the founding idea for him of eugenics, the idea that we should move the dial towards the great people using biological means, because he was a hereditarian. He believed that these are biological characteristics and far less socially mediated than we might today think. Now, a lot of my work is about eugenics, and I will talk about it a bit more specifically in just a minute, but this is not a lecture specifically about eugenics. What I'm interested in talking about for the purpose of this lecture is the fifth of my angry phrases, which is that their personal views, the views of these men of science, these great men of science, are irrelevant to the science that they created. Now, this is a very interesting question, and I imagine that some of you are thinking about this right now. Why do I spend all my time talking about this? Well, we're going through this period of reassessing our intellectual forebears, but at UCL, we've had a specific moment in the last 3 or 4 years because there was an official eugenics inquiry because, as a result of Francis Galton's legacy at UCL in effectively founding the department which would become the Department of Genetics, Evolution, and Ecology, environment. What is our department called? Genetics... What is it? Genetics, Evolution, Environment. I should get that right in front of my boss. But there was a reckoning which finished just before the pandemic in 2020, and the various naming conventions at UCL on campus one of the outcomes of that inquiry were that those names would be removed. So that's the Galton Lecture Theatre, the Pearson Lecture Theatre, and the R.A. Fisher Centre. All of those names have been changed, and also part of the outcome was that they created a salary for me. Now, in answering or attempting to address the question of whether their personal views affected their scientific work, Galton is pretty straightforward. He was an unequivocal white supremacist and a racist, he was not unusual, fairly typical, but quite extreme for the Victorian age. But again, I remembered the point, the one that I forgot on the other side. What was the line? It was, God, did I just win an award for science communication? What was it? They're the men of their time. Yeah, got it. Right. So they're men of the time. The point is that that phrase, they're men of their time, it implies that everyone thinks the same in every era. Right? It implies that everyone is equally racist or white supremacist today or then. If in 100 years' time you said, oh, well, they were people of their time, you'd think, well, this is one of the most politically divisive eras ever. You can't just say what everyone in this room, well, maybe everyone in this room, but you know, maybe everyone in the country has wildly different views. And that's what I mean by contextualizing their views at this time. And it's why saying they are people of their time is a fatuous thing to say. But for Galton, it's easy because he was quite explicit about it. He devoted the rest of his life from about 1869 onwards to promoting the ideology of eugenics, which he said was an ideology, and using science, using new statistical techniques, which he invented, in order to justify the improvement of the British people using biological means. And this is a quote from 1909, and this was the first time I'd seen the word jihad used outside of the context of 21st century repercussions after 9/11, but there it is in 1909. But it is Galton saying we need to have a religious fervor attached to eugenics in order to improve the quality of the British people. So the notion that the science that he invented is independent of his political ideologies is obviously untrue. He was doing the science in order to serve his political ideas. Now, one of his legacies was that he set up, as well as the financial legacy he set up at UCL, he set up the Galton Professorship. And the first part of the behest was that the first Galton professor was Karl Pearson. Here's Karl Pearson. Karl Pearson, unequivocally one of the most important scientists who has ever existed, for multiple reasons. He invents most of the, maybe half of the statistical techniques that most of the modern world depends on, mostly in the 1910s and 20s. But before that, an astonishing polymath. He was a professor of German folklore in Berlin, before becoming a professor of physiology, also in Berlin. But he got bored of Berlin, so he moved to London, where he became a professor of law. And he decided he didn't want to become a lawyer, so he decided to take up a professorship in mathematics, which is not the same pathway that my career has taken. He wrote a book in 1890 called The Grammar of Science, which was a bestseller. And it is the first description, I think, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, but I think it's the first description that anyone describes matter and energy to be interchangeable. Right? And we know, because Einstein wrote about it, that Einstein read this book in the 1890s, and 15 years after it was published, Einstein published his Special Relativity, in which he describes that. So Pearson's influence on science, not just on creating statistical techniques or effectively inventing many of the foundations of population genetics, was also in the formation of special relativity as well. So Pearson, an incredible figurehead in our field. I feel like this isn't going to be a surprise at this point. He also was an incredible racist, a breathtakingly racist man, particularly anti-Semitic in his outlook. So this is the first quote is in reaction to the Boer War in 1896. You can read it for yourself. And the second, just a wildly anti-Semitic thing to say. Now, can you separate Pearson's work from his grotesque racism and support for eugenics? No, you can't, because in handing over in retiring from the Galton Professorship in 1933, he gave a lecture in which he stated quite unequivocally that he developed these statistical techniques in order to promote the ideology of eugenics. He said, the climax culminated in Galton's preaching of eugenics and his foundation of the eugenics professorship. Did I say culmination? No, that lies rather in the future, perhaps with the Reichskanzler Hitler and his proposal to regenerate the German people. So there's Karl Pearson for you, and I think I feel okay in saying that it is impossible to separate the genesis of his work with his political ideologies. Now, in that speech, he's handing over the Galton professorship to Ronald Elmer Fisher, the second Galton professor. And I think that I think it's fair to say that almost all of the statistical techniques that Karl Pearson didn't invent were invented by Ronald Fisher, probably the greatest statistician who has ever lived. The founder, one of the three founders of the modern synthesis, the process by which Darwinian natural selection was fused with the new genetics in order to create our contemporary understanding of evolutionary biology. He was a brilliant man. He wrote in 1930 the foundational text of population genetics, the genetical theory of natural selection. It is an absolutely turgid book. I mean, all unreadable. And has anyone in this room actually read that? I mean, I've tried my best. Someone put their hand up there? Oh, well, he's my PhD student, so he better have. He only started on Monday, so how are you getting on? Yeah. Now, again, not going to be a great surprise, he was extremely keen on eugenics. And this is well documented. It's well documented in one of my books and in other work. He was a co-founder of the Eugenics Society in 1812 as an undergraduate at Gonville and Caius in Cambridge. And he started writing for the first eugenics journal, which was for the Eugenics Education Society in about 1918. And some of those texts are absolutely fascinating because some of them includes clearly the seeds of some of his great work later on. The first description of what becomes known as Fisherian runaway selection are described in an article in 1918, which is why male deers have massive antlers and peacocks have massive tails and things like that. But even in reading those early texts, you can see the seeds of great evolutionary biology, but he does fuse it absolutely with human traits that he equates with selection, including things like ruddy cheeks on men and halitosis. I mean, I suppose halitosis is a good example of negative selection if you're in a bar. But I don't think it necessarily fits in with his paradigm. So I'm dealing with the question of whether their political views are associated with their scientific works. We know that Fisher was a great fan of eugenics. I think how he expressed his views on race are much subtler. I don't think he was particularly racist any more than many upper middle class men of that era, and it isn't expressed like Karl Pearson's was. But he was very keen on eugenics. Now, that book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, of the two people in this room who've actually read it, they will know quite well that only the first 7 of the 12 chapters in it deal with population genetics. The final 5 chapters are about eugenics. They're kind of mad, and there's sort of fantasies about the fall of the Roman Empire, which is a sort of cornerstone of eugenics thinking of this time, and also policy suggestions about taxing people who have fewer children, and so on. There's 5 chapters about this. And we don't really mention this because they're completely bonkers and they're completely irrelevant to the foundational text of population genetics, which occurs in the first 7 chapters, which none of you have read, but they are really important. Now, so you could suggest that maybe that's just a tag on. This is his pet. This is his hobby horse, and so he wants to add it into his great textbook. And if you look at the reviews over the last, almost 100 years of this book, most of them ignore the fact that the last 5 chapters are actually about eugenics. But some work by a historian of Fisher at Oxford University, and this has only happened in the last couple of years, Alex Aylward, and he's been kind enough to share these slides with me for this talk. He went through the Fisher archive, which no one else has really done, which is kept in Adelaide, where Fisher died. And in that, he's discovered the 1919 draft of an untitled book, which becomes The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection. And the very interesting thing about it is that the first chapters in the early draft are the final chapters in the published one. So it appears, and the argument by Alex that I buy into, is that Fisher's initial intention was to write a book about genetics and then use his invented population genetics to justify it. And it was only much later, when he was writing it in 1928 and 30, that he moves those chapters to the end. And we can actually see that. So this is what was chapter 1, which you can see. So this is the index from the published first edition, but you can see that the moving of the chapters from the draft version into the final version includes the eugenics chapters being up front. Now, I think this is quite compelling evidence that Fisher's motivation was to write a book about eugenics and how to change the quality of the British people. Now, Fisher's legacy has been reassessed over the last few years, not just at UCL, but also at Keyes, where he was both undergraduate and subsequently master. And it was in the news that the stained glass window in their chapel, dining room, I don't know, something Cambridge that I don't really understand, was removed after a campaign by first-year undergraduate students, and this was a new story. And this sort of got the ball rolling for us at UCL, reassessing Fisher's legacy and his position on campus, and indeed all over America. The American Statistical Society removed the name of Fisher from various awards and lectures such as this. And the interesting thing about Fisher, here's another point, right? Part of that removal and part of that reassessment was some engagement that I think is generously described as incredibly misguided, which starts in the 1930s with his interactions with a scientist called Ottmar Freiherr von Fischer. And he was a sort of behavioral geneticist who had followed Galton's work on Galton invented the twin studies, and Freiherr von Fischer followed this up. He was particularly interested in lung diseases. And during the 1930s, which obviously is a tumultuous period in German history, here he is with some measuring calipers. He joined the Nazi Party in 1940, but in the run-up to the war, he corresponded with Fisher, and Fisher invited him to London. They lost correspondence during the war, and after the war, as often happened, German scientists sometimes destroyed records which associated them with acts of atrocity or associations with the Nazi Party. And Fischer was, in his denazification trial, was deemed a Mitläufer, so a fellow traveler, Nazi fellow traveler, and he was fined 600 marks. The bit I haven't mentioned is that Ottmar Freiherr von Fischer had a PhD student during the war whose name was Joseph Mengele. Yes. Now, we have no idea, because the records were destroyed, whether Fischer used any of the tissue that we know that Mengele had taken from people murdered in Auschwitz. There are no records of it. It seems unlikely to me that he didn't or was unaware of it, but that is speculation because the evidence does not exist anymore. So when Fischer was trying to rehabilitate his own reputation after the war, he wrote to Fisher and various other people in order to get letters of recommendation in order to get professorships. Now, there are two letters which somewhat condemn Fisher's response, one of which is shown here. And the quote is, there, you can read it for yourself. I have no doubt that the Nazi Party severely wished to benefit German racial stock, blah, 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 blah. I do not doubt that Fischer gave, as I should have done, his support to such a movement. It's not a great thing to say. And this has been part, for the last 4 or 5 years, of the reassessment of Fisher's intellectual legacy. It's, I think, generously described as deeply misguided. But here's the thing. Fisher was, I think, reading a lot about him, I think that he was a frustrated policy wonk. I think he wanted to have influence about eugenics and about culture and about society, but really didn't have much influence. And he became a great scientist and a great statistician, but no one read the last 5 chapters of the Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, and no one really paid a great deal of attention to his views on eugenics at all. Partly to do with some of the history that I'll talk about in just a minute. But in the UK, we never had a eugenics policy. In America, they embraced it wholeheartedly. And so I think that along with Pearson, who until his dying day was a eugenicist, but also didn't think the data was good enough to actually warrant interventions, to warrant state policies. So we were prevented for various reasons in the UK from having eugenics enacted, partially by people who wanted it to happen but thought that the data wasn't good enough. And I think that Fisher was one of those. He was frustrated by his ineffectiveness in promoting eugenics. But these are the reasons that he has been removed from various campuses around the world. And I think this is ironic because we've cancelled him for the wrong reasons. This is a picture of Fisher in the 1950s. And there's a very significant thing happening in this picture, which is that he's smoking a pipe. Now, Fisher was a very keen smoker, as many people were at this time. And we have to bear in mind that by the 1950s, the tobacco industry, particularly in America, was facing a crisis of cataclysmic proportions because smoking had been categorically linked to the dramatic rise in lung cancer. And health concerns had been raised for decades before this, but by the early 1950s, and you'll know the name of Richard Doll, the epidemiological evidence was emerging that there was a very great sort of expansion and consolidation of scientific methods that demonstrated that smoking caused lung disease as well as other serious respiratory and cardiac diseases, and those led to death. And these were being published in large, major peer-reviewed medical journals and reported throughout the general media. So the tobacco lobby and the tobacco industry was having an existential crisis about this. Now, the medical establishment was quite slow to adopt this, and in 1953, about 40 to 45% of doctors still smoked more than 20 cigarettes a day. But the tobacco industry was aware that they were facing this existential crisis and that it was born of scientific data. Now, the evidence that cigarettes cause cancer is pretty striking. It's not just epidemiological by this view, and it's not new by this stage. So Muller, at this stage, 1939, had the first suggestions that in cohorts that smoking significant numbers of ciggies, so over 20 a day, resulted in increased lung cancer. And that was really consolidated a number of case-controlled styles that culminated in Doll's work in 1954, which broadly concluded that smoking 35 plus cigarettes per day increased the probability of getting lung cancer by about 40 times. But we also had animal models before that, so Roffo in 1931, who put concentrated tobacco extract on mouse skins and observed tumor formation. We also had cellular pathology. We know that cilia are destroyed by smoke and that this had been observed in tissue and in animals. And that by 1956, research had shown that smokers suffered from pulmonary ciliostasis, which is the death of cilia in their lung tissue. And we also knew that chemicals within smoke from cigarettes also contained known carcinogens, and this had been known since 1930. So the evidence really was quite strong and multifactorial, and it was that cigarette smoking is not only associated, but actually functionally causes lung cancer. Now, it's difficult to know why Fisher took such strong objection to this, mostly because the only real biography of Fisher was written in the 1980s by his daughter. So another example of how we should analyze history by considering the source and considering who wrote it, why they wrote it, who the intended audience was, and so on, the absolute bog standard cornerstones of doing good history. But Fisher took absolute opposition to this view that smoking caused cancer. And he did it using data that he published in 5 articles over the course of 1956 to 58, 2 in Nature, 1 review article, and 2 in other journals. And let me show you all of the data. That's it. This was Fisher's data. Now, the first table actually comes from the work of Ottmar Freiherr von Fischer, Joseph Mengele's PhD supervisor. Fisher goes into no other details about the provenance of this data. I present to you the totality of Fisher's data, the evidence for resisting the notion that smoking causes cancer. That is it. And when it says, for example, not alike, smoking habits not alike, that is the totality of the description. So I think we can agree that this is substandard, right? This is not good science. And I think this is interesting because it is reasonable to say that Ronald Fisher was one of the greatest statisticians of all time. It's definitely reasonable to say that his books and papers are impenetrable because they're so complex and so technical and born of a man with a colossal brain. So it's kind of baffling to look at this and think, you took opposition to an overwhelming tsunami of data using this to say something which was becoming obvious, that smoking causes cancer, and took really, really visceral opposition to it. Why did he do it? Well, we can guess. I mean, he didn't like authority figures. Smoking was considered, or smoking and anti-smoking was considered a left-right political argument at this time, a little bit like other issues today. He had expressed animosity towards public health intervention, so he had a slightly sort of iconoclastic streak in him, and he was a smoker, but loads of people were smokers at this time, so it's quite difficult to understand why he took such vitriolic hatred for this, for this idea that smoking causes cancer. Here's a couple of quotes from one of the papers on it, which you can read for yourself. So Fisher here is undoubtedly, whether you like it or not, a significant part of scientific disinformation that caused unaccountable pain for individuals as a result of his personal biases that we don't quite understand why. And this is the really interesting bit. As a result, his work and his stance was exploited by the industrial complex of the tobacco industry, who knew at this time that the contribution to global health and happiness was significantly negative. In 1953, a joint cohort of tobacco companies in America employed a PR agency, Hill and Knowlton. And they went through several years of crisis management, how to deal with the fact that all of this evidence was emerging that smoking causes cancer. And they had begun to work out by 1956 that if you told people that the scientists and the doctors were wrong, this is ineffective. So they invented a brand new strategy, which was to sow seeds of doubt. They don't have to say that they're wrong. All they have to say is, we don't really know. Some people think it does, some people think that it doesn't. And they recruited Fisher to this. He was paid, but only £400 or so, which I don't think is a huge amount of money, and so doesn't quite explain. I don't think it's fair to say it's a financial motivation for Fisher. But as a result of this, they come out with a marketing campaign which says the world's greatest statistician says not that smoking causes cancer, but the alternative theory that Fisher had come up with, which is fascinating. So as a hereditarian, so a guy who thinks that genetics plays a stronger role than culture or society or environment in how people behave and biology itself, Fisher came up with an alternative theory, which was this. It was based on the idea that most people who smoke don't get lung cancer, right, which is correct, and that there is a genetic predisposition towards getting lung cancer, which is also correct. But what he figured and what he theorized was that people who have a genetic predisposition to getting lung cancer, when they begin to develop the tumors, they develop an itch, what he described as an itch in their lungs, and that the only way they could alleviate that sensation was by smoking cigarettes. So the clever marketeers of Hill and Knowlton, of the tobacco lobby, worked out that the world's greatest statistician had come up with an idea which said not that smoking causes cancer, but that cancer causes smoking. And Fisher writes this quite explicitly in earlier papers in an interesting way for statisticians, which is, should be analyzed by people learning stats. If A is associated with B, you can't assume that A causes B, and if you do, you could equally assume that B causes A. And Fisher took that to its logical extreme. Here's a report from the National Enquirer of roughly that time, and there is the same picture of Fisher smoking his cigarettes. Now, this all comes from the work of Robert Proctor at Stanford, and he deserves credit for this. He estimates, and I have no reason to doubt him, that cigarettes are the single most lethal object that humankind has ever invented. He's calculated the rate at which cigarettes are smoked. This is data from 2012, and it's at the same speed as the International Space Station. I think it's 6 trillion cigarettes are smoked per year. So I'm not interested in cancel culture or whatever the word du jour is for dealing with these sort of culture war issues. But I do find it fascinating that we continue to venerate and then subsequently, cancel someone, I think probably for the wrong reasons. His impact on eugenics, Fisher's impact on eugenics, are negligible, possibly zero. His impact on science overall is colossal, with the huge branches of not just genetics, but psychology, statistics, and in fact, every data set that needs analysis by one of the techniques that he invented comes from Fisher. But we cannot deny the fact that he is intrinsically involved in one of the most destructive industries that have ever existed on this planet. Was this his fault? No. Should we know about it? Yes, I think we should do. And you'll know as well that that idea, merchants of doubt is how it was characterized in a book in 2010, that the tobacco lobby said, we sell 2 products, cigarettes and scientific doubt. Hill and Nola went on in the 70s to work for a different American industry, which was the fossil fuel lobby, where they also used exactly the same technique, which continues to this day. We don't have to say that you guys are wrong, we just have to say, we don't really know. And there is enough scientific doubt that you can have a crack at this. Is Fisher part of that? I think he is. I've got another 40 slides to go. Anyone who's seen me before will know that this is not unusual. Right, let's do eugenics quickly. Okay, so Francis Galton, he comes up with the idea of eugenics, meaning that he comes up with a scientification of a much older idea that through biological means, either infanticide or arranged marriages, you can improve the quality of a people. He begins to describe it in 1869 and then formalizes it during the next 20, 30 years, and it becomes an incredibly popular idea across political, social and cultural divides. The social context for the emergence of eugenics in Britain, at least, includes these things up here. We have massive expansion of cities as a result of the Industrial Revolution. We have a much more visible poor. And with a visible poor, you have much more visible illnesses. We have the transfer of responsibility for the people at the bottom of society from the church to the state, and a massive increase in the number of institutions. We also have empire at its absolute peak. The peak really comes in 1923, where the British Empire is at its geographical maximum. And as a result of that, increased immigration, we have declinism, the never-ending idea that everything in the past was better and everything is getting worse. We have universal scientific racism. Pretty much everyone thinks that, along the lines of Linnaeus, that race is a real and biological phenomenon and that white supremacy is part of that setup. And then we've got what becomes characterized in the 1920s as the Great Replacement theory, which is the idea that living populations become decadent and have fewer children, and as a result of that, poorer populations begin to infiltrate them, and they have higher fecundity, and they will ultimately replace them. It's an idea which is old. It's described in Plato. It's described in Gibbon, The Fall of the Roman Empire, which I think a lot of these old guys read in the 19th century, or at least they read the cover page where it describes it. I mean, it's 6 volumes, and it's really boring. But it becomes one of the sort of cornerstones of eugenics style thinking. Now, eugenics, the word itself, means sort of well-born, good, genesis, birth. So initially, it is categorized as a positive thing. People want to make society better. But in order to do that, you have to rank people by some categorization means. And if you have to rank people, it means there are some people at the top and there are some people at the bottom. So immediately what happens every time eugenics is either enacted or thought about in countries, 31 countries around the world in the 20th century had eugenics policies on their legislature, what actually immediately happens, it starts off as a good thing and it immediately becomes, well, these are the people we want. want, and these are the people that we don't want. So the people subject to eugenic selection, negative eugenic selection, always include racialized groups. They include people with disabilities. They include people with specific medical diagnoses and non-specific diagnoses, which have sort of historically difficult to understand, such as feeble-mindedness. And they include women with menstrual troubles, and then it's just people we don't like: alcoholics, epileptics, sex workers, and criminals. And the popularity of this idea, which now seems so toxic to us, is almost, but not completely, universal in British culture in the Edwardian era. Here's a couple of examples of that. Adverts on the tube. On the left-hand side, on the right, is a Valentine's card for, I mean, you know, and they say romance is dead. And this is often thought of as a right-wing ideology, but that's not true. It was equally embraced by left-wing thinkers of the time as well. Now, I used to put this slide up and offer students or audiences a free book if they could name all the people, but no one has ever got it, so I put their names up now. But on the top row are left-wing or progressive thinkers who are enthusiastic eugenicists of this era. And I think it's important to recognize that these are the founders of ideas that are part of our contemporary discourse. Virginia Woolf, I think that A Room of One's Own is one of the most important essays ever written. George Bernard Shaw is quite a good production of Pygmalion on at the Old Vic right now. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, part of the founders of the Fabian Society, so left-wing thinkers and development of the labour movement, which ultimately becomes the foundation of the welfare state and the NHS a few years later. On the bottom row, you've got Arthur Balfour, Tory Prime Minister in 1912. He's ex-Prime Minister. In 1912, Winston Churchill is the Foreign Secretary in the Asquith government. So you've got former and future Prime Minister. And Mary Stopes, who you know her name from being the founder of reproductive rights for women. The Mary Stopes Clinic's now called MSI, because Mary Stopes wasn't really interested in the reproductive rights of women. What she was interested in was eradication of the Irish and Slavs and Jews in London. Up until 1938, she wrote love poetry and sent it to Hitler about how awful the Jews were. So I'm doing this quite quickly. So eugenics is not universally popular, but it's left-wing and right-wing. Socialists and conservatives embrace eugenic thinking. It is basically normalized in society. Churchill is the main political driver of eugenics. He read a pamphlet in 1907 that came from the Indiana Reformatory, in which a doctor called L.C. Sharp claimed that he could vasectomize 300 men a day without anesthetic, with no repercussions, which I don't believe. Churchill, William Churchill? Winston Churchill. If you're going to fuck up on a typo, you might as well do it with Churchill. We know that Churchill read Sharp's booklet because he's underlined passages in which he describes the vasectomization of undesirables. And Churchill goes on to propose legislation several times in this era during his years in the Asquith government for the involuntary sterilization of people deemed undesirable, including, for example, in 1912, suggesting using Röntgen rays, X-rays, only discovered, 16 years before that. He writes the early drafts of a bill which becomes the Mental Deficiencies Act, which seeds Parliament in 1913. And in the early drafts that Churchill wrote, he includes involuntary sterilization of the feeble-minded. But due to the campaigning work of one MP, Josiah Wedgwood, also part of the Darwin-Galton clan, that was removed from the legislation. And that's how close we came in this country to having eugenics on the legislation, legislation for this country. Churchill was the big driver. Wedgwood was the filibuster who had it removed. In America, they had a different story. They embraced eugenics with much more enthusiasm and much earlier. Here's an example of in 1912. 1912 is a pivotal year for eugenics. Teddy Roosevelt, writing to Charles Davenport, who I'll talk about in a bit, suggesting that this is the duty of right-minded citizens to remove undesirables from our society. Now, the funding bodies for what becomes the Eugenics Records Office are also the great philanthropists of the East Coast of Long Island, the people that the characters are based on in The Great Gatsby. And they include Mary Harriman, the richest woman in this period, the widow of E.L. Harriman, a railroad tycoon, and John Rockefeller, who's probably the richest man who's ever existed in American history. And with money from these people and also the Carnegies, Davenport, who had met Galton in 1900 in London, traveled back and set up the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor, associated with the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, one of the great centers of research and still one of the best genetic research institutes on Earth. And you can see from this headline in 1912 that this is not just a scientific research establishment, it is the social, you can see that it is about addressing social problems using biology. Now, it's called the Eugenics Records Office because it has two clear aims. The first is generally to promote the idea of eugenics amongst the American people. But the second is to harvest the national family pedigree of American people, records. And that's exactly what they did. So they would send people, mostly women, out who'd been trained to go to state fairs in places like Kansas and Iowa and Indiana, to rural state fairs, and to run eugenics competitions. So fitter family competitions, better baby competitions. They would say things like, over there you're judging the Holsteins and the Friesians, but you should also be judging the Robinsons and the Joneses. And this is the 1920 Kansas State Fair. Now, my colleague and friend, Professor Jennifer Raff, who works at Kansas University, so I bought one of these medals and had it sent to her house, which afterwards I felt was a bit like, buying Nazi memorabilia. She's on sabbatical with us now. I'm just going to pass that round. I need this back, by the way. This, again, normalized in society. If you can breed animals to be better, then why not breed humans to be better as well? And this was generated by the Eugenics Records Office from Cold Spring Harbor under the leadership of Charles Davenport, one of the acolytes of Francis Galton directly. And other than Nazi Germany, America has the most enthusiastic embrace of eugenics of any country. We estimate that somewhere between 70,000 and 500,000 people were sterilized against their will or knowledge during the 20th century. 31 states had eugenics, involuntary sterilization on their state books. For most of the 20th century, the last law was repealed in Oregon in 1986. So people are alive now who were sterilized under eugenics laws in America. This is what the map looked like in 1913. Okay. My timing is appalling. Here is one of my favorite pictures from the history of science. Who's that? Mendel, Gregor Mendel, the founder of genetics, really. Described as Austrian, the Moravian. He wasn't a monk, he was a friar. They are different, I sort of don't care. Gregor Mendel, the Moravian friar, there he is holding what type of plant? No, a petunia. I don't know why he's holding a petunia. A pea is a very reasonable answer to that question, but it's a petunia. We often see this picture of him that is framed out, but I just really like showing the rest of his literal brothers here, because I think they're just having a really stylish time. And this guy looks like, what's this guy doing? Don't know. Check me out. And I don't know, he's kind of scary. So Mendel does his amazing work, what I think is probably one of the greatest experiments in the history of science in the 1850s and 60s, where he breeds together 29,000 pea plants, and with that, statistical patterns emerge that demonstrate that characteristics are passed in discrete packages and predictable statistical formations from generation to generation. You know from school, it's peas being wrinkly or smooth, or leaves, petals being purple or white, and they don't blend, they come out in discrete phenotypes. And these are the foundational principles of inheritance, units of inheritance which become characterized in 1900 as genes, right? Foundations of genetics. The work is written in German, and it's translated into English in 1900, and then becomes part of the pantheon of 20th century biology, a sort of founding part of it. There's nothing wrong with this, and Mendel is exonerated. He's not a bad guy, as far as I'm aware. So he gets a full pass from me on this. But his work lands in Davenport's lap at exactly the right time for Davenport, or the wrong time for American undesirable citizens. Because it suddenly gives Davenport and the eugenicists of the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor a mechanism on which they can act, a pivot on which they can enact their eugenics ideas. And Davenport and the Americans in general at this time become obsessed with the notion that every single characteristic in humans is defined and determined by a single gene. Just like there is a gene for wrinkliness or smoothness in peas, or a gene for purple or white petals, a dominant or negative. You remember this from GCSE biology. Davenport becomes obsessed with the idea that all human characteristics also follow this inheritance pattern. Now, what is the characteristic, the human characteristic, that we use to teach Mendelian inheritance in humans? What is the first characteristics we teach to children? Eye color, right? We all know this, right? There is a gene or an allele, more accurately, that encodes blue eyes, and it's recessive to brown eyes. So you draw a little Punnett square table out, and you put big B, little b, big B, little b, big B, big B, big B, little b, you know, right? Who was the person who published and described this work first? It was Charles Davenport in 1907, The Heredity of Eye Color in Man. This pattern is described for the first time in this paper by Davenport. Now, you know that it's not true, right? You know that if you're doing your GCSEs now, you write what's in the paper. But it's not true. There are dozens of genes involved in influencing, not determining, eye color. And parents, it is probabilistic, because genetics is probabilistic and not deterministic. But you can't really accurately determine the eye color of your children based on the eye color of your parents. And further than that, eye color is not a binary thing. There aren't blue eyes and brown eyes. They have different eye patterns in the same eye. Some people have heterochromia, where they have different eye color in both eyes. So it's probabilistic, and you can make predictions about what eye color will be based on the genotype, but they are predictions. They are not deterministic patterns. But the idea that it is deterministic comes specifically from Davenport himself. Now, in referencing the fact that there are not just blue eyes and brown eyes, he acknowledges that in the original paper and says, and this is a direct quote from this original paper, that hazel eyes exist, but we assume that they're blue. I don't really know what to do with that. What is the second human characteristic that we use to describe human traits that are dominant or negative? Not tongue rolling. Tongue rolling is a good one. What? Oh, so all the geneticists are out here. So earlobes is one, that comes later. Not tongue rolling, that's also not no. Oh, come on, I was going to do hair color. Come on, ginger hairedness. So MC1R is a gene that recessive alleles for which are responsible for red-hairedness. Now, this also comes from Davenport, published in 1909, where he describes the inheritance pattern of ginger-hairedness. This is a caption from a joke report from, I don't know if you can see it, red hair is created by an endangered gene. These babies are cowering because genetics is coming to get them. Now, Davenport didn't have molecular genetics or large-scale GWASs to aid him in this, but in the most recent assessment of hair color from the UK Biobank, one of the great data sets for genetics, what was published about, I think it was 2018, showed that more than 75% of people who have two alleles that supposedly encode ginger hair do not have ginger hair. We don't really know how hair color and eye color work. And these are the most obvious and easiest examples of Mendelian inheritance in humans. They are the basis of how we teach genetics to school children. And yet, both of them come directly from the father of American eugenics with the specific intention of demonstrating that Mendelian inheritance in man, in humans, but he said in man, was something on which we could act, on which we could breed people so that they had traits that were more desirable and breed out people who had traits which were undesirable. He also did work that demonstrated, as far as he was concerned, that sexual proclivity was also Mendelian and monogenic and deterministic, so based on working with sex workers, prostitutes, and also that seafaringness ran in families in a Mendelian way. He was the first person to publish the Mendelian pattern of inheritance for Huntington's disease, and he actually got the mechanism, or the inheritance pattern for this correct. It is autosomal dominant. Woody Guthrie there died of Huntington's. But in the abstract for this paper, he attributes the origin of Huntington's to 3 immigrant brothers from 100 years, which we don't know whether they existed or not, but it's quite clearly associated with the politics of the time where eugenics is considered a facet of immigration. I've still got 10 slides to go. All right, thanks, mate. I don't know who you are, but I like you. Now, contemporary research on this is really important, and this is I think this is the most important reason why we need to know this and why we need to study this. And it is based around the idea that over the short history of genetics, we have moved from this Mendelian one-to-one relationship between monogenic deterministic thinking to a complex multifactorial idea that many genes interacting with the environment and epigenetic factors is the whole symphony of what becomes the phenotype and the behaviors of individuals. So this is the trajectory of genetics over the course of 100 years. But we continue to teach Mendel first. We continue to teach eye color and hair color, and that genes are these discrete factors which are inherited in these very clear inheritance patterns, which is basically not true. Now, research has begun to emerge in the last 5 years where class cohorts in America and a small study based in Leeds has actually tested what the outcome of teaching this type of biology, this type of genetics to school-age children. And what they found, this is work by Brian Donovan, the paper is Carver et al., 2017. The work shows that if you take one cohort and you teach them the traditional way, which starts with Mendel and goes on to complexity and diseases later, and you take another cohort and you teach them complexity and diseases first, but the total amount of content is the same, that you end up with cohorts where the first one, where you teach Mendelian inheritance first, end up with a much more racialized, essentialized view of genetics than the second. Now, these are preliminary studies. I don't have reason to doubt them, but we need to do more research into this. But if they hold up over the next few years, then basically, not only have we been teaching genetics wrong for a century, but we've been offering a disservice to the genetics community by teaching a version of genetics which is not only wrong, but it reinforces ideas of racial essentialism, which have been outmoded for decades. So we are offering not just a disservice to biology students and to genetics, and also to Mendel, who pointed out in his original paper that those flowers and those plants were not wild type. They were already bred so that those characteristics were being expressed in a controlled background. And he also goes on to say, don't apply this to humans, because humans are really complex. But we've ignored all of that for 100 years, and instead we've embraced the eugenicists' view that all characteristics are determined by single genes. And that is what we teach to school children. I could stop there. I mean, there's a natural break point for me to stop there. Shall I? Or do you want me to do the Nazis? All right. I'll do it quickly. All right. Now, that monogenic deterministic thinking is culturally baked into our society. I think it's older than Davenport. I think it dates from just the idea that things are inherited. The first example of monogenic deterministic inheritance is really described in the Talmud, where hemophilia is described, written in the 3rd century BC. But in the press, and this is during the sort of golden era of gene discovery as a result of genome-wide association studies, you just see that this idea is so sticky that the press, left and right, just latch onto it. I tried to get this to be called Rutherford's law for reasons of vanity, but it didn't stick. If you want to help me with that, I'd appreciate it. But the idea that a headline says, the gene for X, scientists discover the gene for X where X is a complex human trait, the gene doesn't exist and the scientists haven't discovered it. Can that be Rutherford's law? Okay, let's go with that. So there's a few examples mad ones like, this one at the bottom from The Atlantic, the gene that predicts what time of day you will die. I don't know how that works. If you get hit by a bus. The 3 from the middle here, gene that will scare you out of your mind, the gene that makes you politically left-wing, and the gene that makes you unfaithful to your partner, they're all in the Daily Mail. And the cool thing about that is it's all the same gene. DRND4. Imagine having that as a phenotype. permanently terrified liberal love rat. But the negative, we joke, that's funny, right? In 1912, Herbert Goddard, who was the first person to translate the IQ test into English from French, was working on a case study of a woman called, an 8-year-old girl called Deborah Kallikak in his care, who he described as a standard-issue, feeble-minded girl, the type that fill our reformatories. And he decided to try and understand why she was feeble-minded, where this came from. And he did this by plotting out her family tree. And he tracked back 8 or 9 generations and discovered that she was the progeny of a returning Revolutionary War hero called Martin Kallikak, who on the way back from the Revolutionary War stopped off in a bar, a tavern, and impregnated what he described as an attractive but feeble-minded barmaid, unnamed. And then he went home to his Quakeress, upstanding, fine wife and had a large family. But the attractive but feeble-minded barmaid also had a family. And Deborah Kallikak was the terminal branch in that family, which was replete with miscreants, criminals, and people with developmental disorders. Whereas the family that he had with his legitimate Quakeress wife was filled with lawyers and doctors and scientists and bankers. And this became, I think, the founding myth of American eugenics. This becomes textbook for many, many years. The book itself, which is called The Kallikak Family, A Study in Feeble-Mindedness, published in 1912, goes on to become a bestseller. But as late as 1955, it's in textbooks, undergraduate textbooks, where you can see there's the cartoon, married a worthy Quakeress, dallied with a feeble-minded tavern girl on the left-hand side. She has 10 children, one of whom is known as Old Horror, but on the other side, 7 upright, worthy children. Now, hold that thought for a second, because we're going to switch to England in 1912, which, again, a pivotal year in the history of these types of ideas, because it is the incidence of the first Eugenics International Conference held at a site down, which is now Imperial College. And this is the brochure from it. It's a fantastic abstract, and for the scientists in the audience, it describes talks, some of which are lantern-lit slideshows. There will be a bell rung with 3 minutes to go, and again with 30 seconds to go. Sorry, Jonathan. And it also describes places where you can get sandwiches around the back as well. Now, there's an official write-up for it, but it's not verbatim. I want to show you some of the cast list of the people there to show you quite how influential this type of thinking is at this time. Read them for yourselves, but you've got Darwin's there. You've got David Starr Jordan, the founder of Stanford University there. Bateson, founder of the Genetics Society, us. Headmaster at Eton. Arthur Balfour, former Prime Minister. Balfour goes on at the dinner, he gives the plenary keynote speech at the dinner, goes on to award the first professorship in genetics on Earth, the Balfour Chair, which still exists to this day and is held by Anne Ferguson Smith, who I must stress is not a eugenicist. But the first is given to Reginald Punnett at Cambridge, of the Punnett Square, the thing that you draw out your eye color. And I have to confess that I was in my mid-30s when I discovered that Reginald Punnett designed that. I thought it was named after strawberry boxes. I blame my educators at UCL. But Reginald Punnett talks at this conference and says something which when you read the notes, you think, God, thank God he said that, so he says, I don't think we've got enough knowledge about the inheritance patterns of most human conditions to warrant eugenic intervention. And I read that for the first time a few years ago and went, finally, someone's saying it. And it goes, comma, apart from feeble-mindedness, which is monogenic and deterministic and should be acted on immediately. I don't know whether he read the Goddard book on the Kallikaks, but it was published the same year, and we do know that Goddard had a stand. He wasn't present, but he had a stand at that conference. Now, again, they were men of their time, fatuous argument. They were fatuous arguments, and there were fatuous arguments there, because here we have arch-eugenicist Pearson pointing out that the American model of monogenic deterministic thinking for this is not accurate, and it should be dismissed. It's not that he wants it to be dismissed because he opposes eugenics. He wants it to be dismissed because he doesn't think the data is up to it. So, swings and roundabouts. He published 3 papers over the course of 10 years saying that the American model was bad. Thomas Hunt Morgan, another founding father of genetics, also points out that these are not just genetically inherited conditions, but they are communicated rather than inherited. Communicated here meaning non-biologically inherited, but socially and culturally mediated. But you know what? None of this shit matters, because the Kallikak study was a fraud. The barmaid never existed. She had been made up. The Kallikak family was an entirely different family, unrelated to Martin Kallikak himself. So this whole founding myth of American eugenics was actually based on a complete fraudulent story. Its impact is, well, we will see its impact because for the last 2 minutes, I will cover Nazi Germany. This is Alfred Ploetz. So he independently comes up with ideas that he coins the word Rassenhygiene, so race hygiene. Just like personal hygiene and public hygiene are there to protect individuals and the public in general, Rassenhygiene is there to protect the race. He traveled as a socialist thinker to Iowa to work on a communal farm, but was so appalled at what he described as the low quality of the people there that he came back and committed the rest of his life to promoting ideas of eugenics in Germany, first Second Reich, then into Weimar years, and then into the Third Reich itself. Now, many books and many studies, there's a whole body of literature on the rise of eugenic and race hygiene thinking as part of the cornerstone of the Third Reich and the Holocaust itself. But broadly, these ideas develop over the 1910s and into the 1920s. Nordic purity is a key idea here. 1920, Lebensunwerte Lebens is introduced in a textbook, lives unworthy of life. And one of the first laws passed by Hitler after he takes the German chancellorship in February 1933 is the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. The thing that most people don't know, and I develop in other work and in other talks, is that almost all of the scientific, financial, and legal foundations for Hitler's eugenics policies, his race hygiene policies, were derived specifically from the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor. The Rockefeller Foundation funded them. The template laws were drawn from the ERO, the Eugenics Records Office, and they were inspired by Charles Davenport, who was out in Berlin during the 1930s. Now, the Germans were very good propagandists, and part of the motivation for Hitler going to war was to enact eugenics policies, which is why they were backdated in November 1939 to the 1st of September, when the invasion had happened. And cinema was a big part of the propaganda machine in Germany. 1935, 7 short films, 15-minute films were published to run as B-roll in front of the major films in the cinemas, in order to promote the racial hygiene ideas that were being enacted by the Nazi regime. And one of them was called Das Erbe, which means the inheritance, roughly. And in this, a young female researcher is observing 2 stag beetles rutting, lecking, fighting. And she doesn't know what they're doing. So she asks her supervisor, who sits her down in front of a film and shows her examples of the Darwinian struggle for existence. And it includes stags fighting with each other. It includes cats hunting birds and dogs that have been bred specifically to be pedigrees for specific hunting and purposes. And she gets it halfway through. She bursts out laughing and says, "I get it. Nature has its own racist policies as well." Just after that, the film cuts to the voiceover where they use the Kallikak data, the Kallikak family tree, to demonstrate that feeble-mindedness runs in families, and therefore this is a justification for the slaughtering of, initially from 1935 onwards, babies and children under the age of 5 who are deemed unworthy. So you've got this direct lineage that starts earlier than 1912, but the fraudulent data that comes from Goddard that is based on this monogenic deterministic thinking, which is propagated by Davenport, which comes from Mendel, from all of these ideological ideas, starts there and it ends in the Holocaust. 2 more slides. This is the Haldane Lecture. Haldane wrote this book in 1938, Heredity and Politics. Now, Haldane gets a good pass from us because he was a terrific writer, and he was a funny writer as well. And in this book, he disassembles the eugenic policies of the Nazis and the Americans. And he says that on the first page. "I don't believe our present knowledge of human heredity justifies such steps." He was a left-wing thinker, and I think we give him a big pass for that. But he wasn't really a left-wing thinker at all. He was a revolutionary communist. He was a Stalinist, in fact, a Soviet who supported Stalin's policies well into the 1950s, by which stage we knew Stalin was a bad guy. And these are policies that were both anti-scientific, anti-evolutionary, anti-genetics, and caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. So thank you for the Haldane Award. And I'll leave you with someone who is much, much easier to forgive. Thank you very much.